America has Americana. Great Britain has Britpop. But what does Australia have? Hey everyone, Liam from Solitude here, and in this video today, I'm going to be talking about a genre of music that I call Australiana. Now, this genre of music really does not get talked about enough or potentially collectivized enough, and it's kind of difficult to nail down this sound specifically, maybe a little bit more difficult than Americana and Britpop, but I certainly think it's out there, and there's definitely music that is specifically made for Australians, by Australians, and does well in this country. What would I define Australiana as? Well, I would firstly take a look at Americana and Britpop and draw a couple of comparisons to those two. If you think about an Americana artist, one that comes to mind is Bruce Springsteen, and something that he does is he writes lyrics about his home country, things that are happening in his culture, and he's able to articulate it in a way that's quite enjoyable to listen to. He also has quite a heartland feel to his music. It's quite spatially aware. And if we look at Britpop, one of the things that sticks out to me is the kind of cheekiness that it has and the way that it articulates British culture that only British people could understand. I think if we mesh these two things together and think about Australian culture, that's what I would define Australiana as. It usually describes Australian culture in a specific way, using nuance and clever articulation that potentially only Australians would understand. It usually does have some sort of heartland feel to it. It's usually quite spatially aware, and sometimes it leans into cheeky things within our culture that only us Aussies would get. And one other factor that's quite prominent within the Australiana genre, I believe, is singing in an Australian accent. Now, it's very common to hear Western music that's either sung in a British or American, particularly Californian accent, but singing in an Australian accent is very unique and obviously stands out quite a lot. So the history of Australiana music is a little unclear, but I've done my best to kind of nut it out and narrow it down. Now, looking back, modern Australian culture, and I'm talking about the colonised Australian culture, is not that old. Obviously, our Indigenous heritage is much older, and I'll touch on that a little later, but I'm specifically talking about more Western music within our culture. So one of the most famous and prominent musicians / poets of Australian history would be Banjo Patterson, who you can find on the $10 note. I guess one of his most famous pieces of work is Waltzing Matilda. It's the sort of song that will get sung at a Wallabies rugby game.
And he sang as he watched and waited until his belly boiled. You'll come waltzing Matilda with me.
Someone else that comes to mind as a poet would be Henry Lawson. And a bit further on from there, once we started getting into the rock and roll era of contemporary music, we had the likes of the Seekers pop up, who obviously weren't rock and roll, but, contemporary music had kind of evolved from there. Someone kind of doing that a little bit more country stuff as well was Slim Dusty. But then we saw the emergence, probably in the 70s, of Australian bands trying to articulate what was happening within their country in a way that was popular. One of the first bands to do this, in my opinion, would probably be Skyhooks. Their album Living in the 70s was one of the biggest in that decade that came out of this country and is a hugely influential album on many bands from the years that followed.
I'm living in the 70s. I feel like I've lost my keys. I got the right
Now, in the 80s, we saw a boom in Australian musicians attempting to delve into the culture within their music. Some of the big names that come to mind were the Go-Betweens, Cold Chisel, the Triffids, Hunters and Collectors. Midnight Oil were probably the first to do it in a politically charged way that was successful. And in my opinion, we have the quintessential Australiana artist, Paul Kelly. Now, there's something very special about Paul Kelly in particular. He was able to do this Australiana thing in a way that seemed on another level than everyone else, and he also kind of made it part of his brand. Cold Chisel, for example, were known to talk about Australian culture, but they were also kind of just known to be a pub rock band. Whereas Paul Kelly in particular, if someone was speaking about him, they would say, oh yeah, that guy who writes songs about the MCG.
I'm high on the hill, looking over the bridge to the MCG.
Paul Kelly was also able to make music quite effectively about Indigenous culture, which was quite a difficult thing to achieve for a white person, but to my knowledge, he gets a lot of respect for the way he's done it from the Aboriginal community. Now, speaking of that culture, we also saw the emergence of a band called Yothu Yindi and an artist by the name of Archie Roach, who were able to articulate their experiences with Australian and Indigenous culture in a very effective way too. Now, in this decade, we also saw the emergence of specific songs that were able to articulate Australian culture very well. And it didn't necessarily mean that these bands were specifically playing Australiana music like Paul Kelly was, but they were able to achieve it with at least one release. Some songs in particular that come to mind were Solid Rock by Goanna,
Solid rock, standing on sacred ground, living on.
Great Southern Land by Icehouse,
Great Southern Land.
and of course Down Under by Men at Work. When it came to the 90s, we obviously saw the alternative become much more popular with the breakthrough of grunge in America. Now, much of the concentration on music was now about trying to make music that sounded alternative and underground, and not so much about Australian culture. Although later on in the decade, that didn't stop a couple of bands emerging in the local scenes to try and do this. In Perth, we saw a young band called Jebediah talk about their hometown a little bit, and they were specifically able to do it with that kind of nasally Perth accent, which I find to be iconic. Powderfinger were also able to kind of take it in a slightly politically charged direction and did it in a very successful way with their album Internationalist. But probably the band that achieved the greatest success with Australiana sounds in the 90s would be UMI.
I'm sure it could make your head fit right.
In particular with their album Hourly Daily. This whole album was basically a homage to 90s suburban life in Australia and perfectly articulated this sound. Now, once it got to the 2000s, we kind of saw a little bit of a breaking away from Australiana generally, but we still saw some musicians play songs and make sounds with an Australian feel to it, though they might not have really spoken about the culture a whole lot. A lot of the kind of like indie acoustic artists were putting out stuff like this, and I'm referring to the likes of Missy Higgins.
I've hardly been outside my room in days.
Sarah Blasco, Josh Pike, Boy and Bear. It was usually kind of like folk tinged and with an Australian accent, but not necessarily a whole lot about Australia, just about maybe things that were happening in their life. I still kind of class this as Australiana. Another band that was really hitting home runs with the Australian accent and feel, in my opinion, in the 2000s was an emo band called Kiss Chasey.
I want a song that gets attention. This is the way it goes.
This one is a band that's kind of slipped under the radar over the past 20 years, but in the mid-2000s, they were arguably one of the biggest Australian rock bands and probably the most successful to do that sound with an Aussie accent. We probably saw the Aussie accent die down a bit around the turn of the 2010s and come through again with a huge revival, in particular thanks to two artists. The first being the Smith Street Band.
And tonight I'm getting young drunk, walking around the streets where I grew up.
They are essentially, in my opinion, the perfect Australiana band. They basically tick all the boxes for what I was describing when I first introduced the idea of Australiana. They have a lot of spatial awareness. They hit that heartland sort of feel. I mean, they were hugely influenced by Bruce Springsteen, initially being called Will Wagner and the Smith Street Band, a homage to Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band. They've got a lot of cheekiness in their lyrics about Australian things, and obviously they sing in a thick Australian accent. I guess one thing that's kind of interesting about the Smith Street Band is that the Australian accent in Will Wagner's voice is so thick and it's really hard to get past if you're not an Australian person, that I could really see it being difficult for anyone other than Australians to be liking this music. Another artist who was able to do this Australiana stuff in the 2010s with probably even more success was Courtney Barnett. Now, Courtney Barnett was similar to Will Wagner's singing style in that she just really honed in on the thick Aussie accent and did not care. She often spoke about funny little odd things happening that she could see in Australia.
Oliver Paul, 20 years old, thick head of hair, worries he's going bald.
But the main difference between her and the Smith Street Band was that she probably had a slightly lighter edge on her sound, which essentially made her a little bit more palatable, and she broke out in other countries. She even got nominated for a Grammy. Now, since the breakthrough of these two artists in particular, over the last 10 or 12 years, it seems to have been collectively agreed that singing in an Australian accent was cool again, and we saw more sort of like emo-inspired artists emerge doing this Australiana thing. Some of the big names being Luca Brasi, The Heartaches, Camp Cope, Sly Withers, and Series. We've also had our emergence of solo artists doing this as well, Carla Geneve, Ruby Fields, and again, another subgenre that's emerged, kind of shooting off this Australiana direction, that sort of bogan garage rock. We've had some big names lately like the Chats,
I'm on Smartphone, so leave me alone. I'm on Smartphone, so leave me alone.
Amel and the Sniffers, and Bad Dreams really emerge in the underground in Australia and have a lot of success overseas too. So that's the story of Australiana and all the artists that I know of who have been involved in it. Do you know any others that I didn't mention today that have made great Australian sounding music? Comment them below.